So, oh goodness, we've got more people joining us. That's exciting. Lovely. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. All right, and over to introducing our special guest of honour. Sue Smethurst is an award-winning author and journalist who has spent more than 20 years working in the media across television, radio and magazines. She has written 8 books, including Behind Closed Doors, Spartacus and Me, Blood on the Rosary and A Diamond in the Dust. The Freedom Circus is described as one family's death-defying act to escape the Nazis and start a new life in Australia. It tells the remarkable true story of the Horowitz family and the circus that saved their lives during the Holocaust. Reminiscent of The Greatest Showman and Schindler's List, the Freedom Circus will have you gripped to the very last page and is an important new chapter in Australia's Holocaust history. It is an amazing true story of hope, love, persecution, and the power of laughter. It will also make you cry a lot. That's just something I would like to add. Over to Sue, who will start with a reading from the book.
Thank you, Amy, for that lovely introduction, and I'm sorry that I've made you cry. I do try not to do that, but I unfortunately do have a habit of making people break into tears, which probably says a lot about my personality, frankly. Thank you all, firstly, for joining us this evening. I'm so thrilled to have been asked to come and do this. Of course, my home libraries. I was in Gippsland, home on the weekend, albeit just for one day, and really did not want to leave and come back to Melbourne, but here we are. So it's lovely to have a little touch of Gippsland in my life again tonight. I can see on my top bar, there's a few familiar faces there. Hello Karen, how are you? Can't see all of you though. I can only see like 3, so I'm sure there's others there. So hello to everyone that's joined us and hello to everyone who I know. Stick your hand up, say hi. I hope you're all in your pajamas underneath your Zoom tops there. That was the prerequisite dress code for this evening. It was a cup of tea, a glass of wine and pajamas, and I will not show you what goes on from behind this part down because that would just be very wrong. Suffice to say, leisure wear is acceptable this evening and elasticized pants are absolutely de rigueur following lockdown, and we can all live with that. The girls asked me to do a little reading to begin with. And I will categorically say that reading my own work does kind of slightly make me feel like I want to vomit. It's something, some authors really love reading their own work. I'm one of those that I kind of go, oh, really? I just spent my whole life with that. Do I have to read it again? But I'm going to do a reading. So, and this is actually the first time that I have read any pages out loud of the book since I was actually writing it. So, and I'll explain to you after I've read this little section why I've chosen this particular part. But this is chapter 15 or part of chapter 15, which was actually originally, it began its life as chapter 1 of the book and then got moved. But so I'll explain that to you too. And so it goes. The hypnotic rhythm of the Axel's arms clicking over, which had lulled Kubush into sleep, suddenly changes pattern. The circus train is slowly grinding to a halt. It's been some time since the last wave of applause swept over them, and they've been travelling a long time, but not long enough to be home. Kubus nudges the man on the camp bed next to him and places a finger to his mouth, signalling towards the door. On his hands and knees, he crawls across the splintered floor, taking full advantage of the gap in the wagon's side panels. It is dark, but he can hear Lala. My artists are asleep, she says with faux anger. Loud enough to warn them all, but not so loud it is obvious she is doing so. This is the very best circus in Europe, and we are expected in Warsaw. You are holding up our journey. Before carefully adding, there are no Jews here. A deep chill runs through Kubush's blood when moonlight catches the curve of the soldier's black helmet. He silently moves back to his Hessian bed, signalling to Fievel, and they both quickly pull out the silver crucifix necklaces they've been wearing tucked under their shirts. They shut their eyes and lie silent and still in the darkness, feigning sleep. Jackboots crunch along the gravel. The ladder to the old gypsy boxcar is dropped to the ground. Kubush thumbs the little chain around his neck and prays to any god that will listen. Breathe. The officer pushes through the bright red checked shirt and overcoat hanging from a makeshift clothesline, crudely strung between the walls of the carriage. He shines his torch up and down and around, searching every corner of the wagon for signs of Jewish scum. On the floor, the light catches the bulbous toes of a pair of oversized leather boots, then inches up to a Bible resting underneath tins of white face paint and talcum powder and a small round mirror on top of an upturned wooden crate, a makeshift dressing table. The torch slowly follows the line of Kubush's body, and when it reaches his shoulders, it stops. The tip of the officer's rifle flicks back his blanket, the light catching a glimmer of the small silver crucifix carefully on display around his neck. Satisfied, he leaves and moves on to the next carriage. Breathe. Now that particular passage, which is part of chapter 15, is one of the very vivid memories that my husband has of his grandfather, and his grandfather telling him the stories, which were then told to him as fairy tales when he was a child, of how he survived, escaped and tricked the Nazis into believing that he was Catholic and not Jewish. He wore a crucifix around his neck permanently so that if ever there was a situation like this was where the Nazis were checking who he was, the crucifix would indicate in some way that he wasn't Jewish at all. And in this particular occasion, it saved his life on a train. And my husband remembers his grandfather telling him the story about the Nazis coming onto the train and how they checked them all, but he pretended that he was asleep and pulled his crucifix out. And that was how he survived. So that chapter was actually the very, very first chapter that I wrote in the book. It's one of my husband's most vivid memories of his grandfather, and literally that was sort of the first thing that came out. And originally it was going to be the first chapter of setting the scene in the book, but we moved it into the book because there were so many other things that we wanted to go first. As always happens in a book like this, there's lots of chopping and changing and editing that goes on, and how it begins is never quite how it ends. It's always a bit of a movable feast and a jigsaw puzzle, but that one's particularly special to him. So that was one that I thought that I would read. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sue. So Kylie and I have some questions for you now, and I'll hand over to Kylie.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, Sue, that was great. So the first question we have is, how did you come to know about this story?
So this story, which is, to give a brief sort of overview, is the story of how my husband's grandparents survived the Holocaust. And when I first came into the family, when my husband and I began going out and eventually got married, I heard snippets of it from him. There was always a little bit of a tale here and there, a joke that his grandfather had told him, or a funny story. And it always interested me to know more. I mean, I didn't know a great deal about the Holocaust growing up in Churchill and going to school in Traralgon. Kildare College didn't exactly focus too much on the Holocaust as part of our history. In fact, I think probably the most that we learnt was perhaps reading the Diary of Anne Frank. So their story, and this incredible story of how they escaped, and the snippets that I heard really intrigued me. But then she didn't really speak about it. Nana didn't speak about it. So we would sit down for family dinners and occasions like that, but it wasn't something that Nana ever spoke about. It wasn't talked about around the dinner table. And the reasoning that the family believed that it would re-traumatise her to speak about it. So it was just kind of this hush-hush, no one ever asks. But it always fascinated me, and I always wanted to know more.
So I've got the next question for you, Sue. So given that Manya, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You are. Good job.
Given that that was such a traumatic experience, and one that she didn't really speak about much, how did you? I know you sort of cover this off a bit in sort of the prologue, but how did you end up sort of convincing her to talk to you about her experiences?
Yeah, well, it was essentially bribery, down to in a gentle, loving kind of bribery way. So as I just explained, the family didn't think that, you know, it was sort of this unspoken thing. We don't ask Nana about it because we don't want to re-traumatize her. She doesn't talk about it, etc. But as my children grew older, I really felt that it was important that we understood their family history for the children more so than anything. And it was never set out originally to be a book. It was really sort of someone needs to take down this story, you know, Nana's story and these details before we lose her, because she was getting older by that stage. But in the end, I could see that time was running out, and I really did get a sense of desperation that we need to do this soon, because if she goes and this story goes with her, we're going to regret it. So the family, with their blessing, said, well, look, go on, she'll talk to you. And I had this little black and white tin of photos that she'd given my mother-in-law when she moved into the Jewish nursing home. Very much kind of, oh, here, you know, you look after this. So I started going in to visit her in the nursing home, and I would take in these beautiful little photos, none of which had any details on them. There were no names, no dates, just this sort of random collection of photos. And under the premise that I would get her to talk about what was in them and who the people were and name them. But to do that, I had to get her attention first. Now, Nana was always interested in talking about Collingwood and what Nathan Buckley was doing. He was still playing at that stage. So it was always Collingwood and Eddie Maguire and pretty much everything else other than talking about herself. She was a very glamorous woman, very witty and very funny and very sharp right until her dying days. And she was always dressed to the nines. So whether you went in at 7 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock at night, hair was done, lips were done, eyebrows were drawn on, jewellery was on, and not just one piece of jewellery, but all of her jewellery was on at the same time. She really was the Princess of Montefiore. So, and she would always say to us not to bring cakes or sweets or chocolates or anything like that because they would ruin her figure. So I played up to her better self, and I would take her nail polish. Love painting her nails. So I'd go in armed with the latest, brightest nail polish that I could find. And Nana would be very excited about that. And she'd sit there and in her room and she'd start to paint her nails. And for that moment in time where she was painting her nails, and she would chat, and I had her complete attention. And so we started, and I'd literally pull out one little photo at a time and say, Anna, can you tell me who's in this photo, or where was this taken? And so the story began. And we followed that path, that pattern. Once she'd had the nails done, we'd go down into the restaurant, to the lunchroom at the nursing home, and she'd sit with a table full of little old ladies around her. And she always liked an audience. And then we'd start to chat all over again. And it was literally the very first day that I did this with her. We were sitting around the table at lunch, and I was starting to ask her questions again. And she said, but why are you even interested? Why do you want to know all this? Why are you interested in this? Kind of, you know, why are you bothering me with this? And she said, look at it, and what about her and her and her and her? And she pointed to all of these ladies around the table and said, what about their stories? And that's when it really twigged to me that it wasn't actually re-traumatizing her to tell her story again. She didn't tell it because she just didn't think it was anything particularly special, because everyone around her had suffered in some capacity. They lived in Caulfield among the Jewish community and were a part of the Jewish community. Everyone she knew of her age had been persecuted, had survived the Holocaust, had had some atrocity happen, had lost family. So she didn't think that her story was anything particularly special. And that was really a light bulb moment for me, and it really was sort of the catalyst to give me the impetus to keep going. You know, it wasn't re-traumatizing. Hello, Janet.
Hello.
Can you turn your microphone off, Janet?
She's just come in. There you go.
That's all good. Janet, I've just muted you. So, yeah, thanks for joining us.
All right. So I might move on to the next question then, Sue. At 96, how much could Meindler remember, and how much did you have to research?
A lot, and a lot is the short answer to that. She did remember a lot, which really was really quite interesting to me, that I would ask her specific things. And at this stage, I only had a skeleton of the story. So I was really trying to just sort of work out the bits and pieces and what happened in the timeline and sort of just start to put it together. But those very emotional moments, she remembered with absolute clarity. And she was a woman who really kept up with the times, right, even until she died. She was very witty and very sharp. But things like the moments where her child was taken from her when she was imprisoned in Russia, she remembered those like they were yesterday, and she could talk very clearly through the emotion of having a child ripped out of your arms, the moment when war hit Warsaw and when the Nazis came. So there were moments that were embedded in her, and obviously those moments were the ones that were particularly emotional and traumatic, losing her mother, going to seeing Kubush again, finding him after she'd been in jail and being reunited. They were all crystal clear in her mind. And what I found intriguing about that was that she had lived with this sitting under the surface of her skin for so long. She never spoke about it. She never spoke about it with her family. It was not something that we ever discussed. They moved on with their life when they arrived in Australia, but clearly that just sat there under the surface, and that trauma and that experience never actually went away. She just found some other capacity to be able to put it to one side and not potentially deal with it and move on with her life. Sadly, she died not that long after we started, several months after we started this process. So for me, it all sort of came to a bit of a grinding halt. Life went on. There were other books that I'd written, but the tin of little photos sat on my desk, and I was really continually just coming back whenever I had time to try and find more and more of the story. I wanted to know, well, what happened to her family? And there were things that we didn't really get into discussing in great detail in relation to her family. All she would say was, well, they all died. And that the hand went up. And I kind of knew when the hand went up that it was sort of time to move on to something else. So to really then put the flesh onto the bones of the story, that was actually the hard part. And it literally did take 5 years of research. The last 2 years of which were pretty much full-time to try and really uncover what had happened. And that meant very in-depth research about the circus, very in-depth research about history. I don't speak Polish, so I immediately found that there was a disconnect between what I needed to know and trying to find that in Poland. And I was very, very fortunate. I kept coming across sort of hurdles the whole time, but I was very lucky to be introduced to a historian based in here in Melbourne, a woman who specifically finds lost families, speaks Polish, Hebrew, all of these things. And she really was the catalyst unlocking the doors for me. She was able to find documents. She was able to help me put the pieces together, and she was able to translate documents for me. So we went along that path for a long time. And then in August of last year, pretty much when I got to the end of the research and I knew what I was looking for and what else I needed, my husband and I went to Poland and literally walked their footsteps, followed their footsteps. We found where they'd lived. We found the tannery where she'd worked. We followed the path that she would have taken from her tannery to home and from home to where the circus was. And we went to Bialy. We followed the route that she took to Bialystok to see what that would have been like for a very young woman at the time on her own, fleeing the Nazis with literally a baby on her hip. And that was really, you know, a fantastic thing to do. And it was really sort of the icing on the cake for the research for me to be able to put into perspective where things were, how they looked, to be able to see how things looked, would have looked through her eyes, and really give me a far greater sense of the colour and size and scope. And I loved it. I mean, it was, you know, it was immensely fascinating, and it was for us, and it was really like closing the loop of that research journey, to be able to see it yourself and just map it out as it was.
Thank you, Sue. That's great. I'm just wondering, so for those of us watching and listening this evening who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading the book, could you give a little bit of a sense of where the family were when the war broke out?
Sure. So literally, my grandfather-in-law was a clown with the very famous Circus Staniewski. He was a performer. The circus had two troupes. They had a central auditorium in Warsaw, which was a beautiful, beautiful building. And then they had a touring troupe as well. And over that particular period of time, when war broke out, My grandmother-in-law was in Warsaw with her baby and her family, and he was away in Białystok touring. What that meant was, although at that time Białystok was actually in Poland, very soon after the war it wasn't. So they were divided. Once war broke out and the Nazis occupied Warsaw and at first Białystok, it was then handed over to Russian territory. So an occupied territory went through the middle. There was a border that divided, and suddenly these two cities were actually in different countries under totally different regimes. So she was under Nazi rule in Warsaw and he was under Stalin's rule in Białystok, which is unfathomable to think about today for a city that's probably, I guess, you know, essentially from Melbourne to Morwell is the distance. But this, the way that the war unfolded, they were in these very different places and they realistically had no way of getting to one another. They were separated. And of course, as soon as war hit Warsaw and the Nazis invaded Poland, the conditions in Warsaw became absolutely unbearable. There was very little food. The Nazis bombed the city virtually within oblivion. There was very little housing and accommodation left. Every second building was knocked down. There was no food. They were literally eating horseflesh off the streets because it was the only thing that they could find, or scraps of bread. And war, as this progressed and the situation worsened and worsened, she was really starting to worry about how she could get out of there. There was a lot of talk that the ghetto was going to be built. They knew that ghettos had been built in other towns and they knew what this meant. So there was a desperation for her to try and escape this as quickly as she possibly could, with the view of being reunited with her husband in Białystok. I think Kylie needs to... Oh, there you go.
Sorry. It probably leads on good to the next question, is what role did the circus play in their reunion?
So the circus was integral in absolutely everything. What happened was they essentially passed one another. She headed towards Białystok to try and find him. At the same time, the circus was given leave to be able to go from Russian territory back to Warsaw. And they passed one another along the way of that journey, and never actually connected with one another. When he came back to Warsaw and realised that she wasn't there, he was stuck. He really had very little option of getting out. The circus at that stage had stopped because their building had been bombed, but they were very canny. The circus owners were very canny people. Most of the circus troupe was Jewish, and these people were in serious danger. So they realised that the best possible thing that they could do to save their own lives was to form the circus again, to restart and to start going again. And they essentially bribed the Nazis to be able to do so. The local Nazis went along with this because there were bribes being paid every night, and they were able to come in with their girlfriends and the high polloi, I guess, of Polish society, and come in and enjoy the circus. And it was a very prestigious thing to do. So each night they performed for the Nazis, and essentially while the Nazis laughed, they lived. But what was going on behind the scenes was that they were then they were buying themselves time every day to be able to plan their escape, which they did. And he eventually used the cover of the circus to escape and fled to Białystok, where he was able to be reunited with Mindla. At that time, she was in prison in Białystok. When she arrived in Białystok, it was assumed that she was a German spy. She was a very attractive and young woman with a baby on her hip who was blonde and blue-eyed and very Aryan looking. So they assumed that she was a spy and tossed her into a jail where she'd been for 9 months. So they'd both been enduring a very, very long separation from one another in quite different but equally horrific circumstances. When I think about what he had to do every night, going out and performing to rows and rows of soldiers in these dreadful outfits with their jackboots and their helmets, living up life, knowing full well the horrors that they were committing outside on the streets every day. I can't imagine how difficult that would have been to endure, but they did. They put on the professional face, and through the cover of the circus, basically hiding in plain sight, they were able to escape.
Thank you for that, Sue. I've got the next question for you. So moving along the trajectory of the story a bit, what happened when the family arrived in Australia?
Yes, so Australia really was a wonderful opportunity for them. They arrived here in 1949 on the ship Toscana, which sailed up the bay and literally dropped them off at St Kilda Pier, not too far from Luna Park. They had ice creams on the beach and discovered this beautiful, wonderful country that they'd heard so much about. But they made a pledge to one another on that day that they would not look back. Pop's words to Nana were, "No good comes from looking back. From today, we start a new life and we move forward." And that's essentially what they did. And the past was not spoken about again. They did everything that they could to set up a life here. Australia offered them opportunity and offered them the opportunity for the first time in their lives to put their head down on the pillow at night and know that they would actually wake up again in the morning. They'd never had that stability and that security before. They did every job that they could get their hands on. They drove taxis, they set up milk bars, they sewed buttons on shirts and shoulder pads into jackets. They did everything because they felt that Australia was the lucky country and had given them such a wonderful opportunity. It was the land of sunshine and ice creams. But the longing inside Kubish, the entertainer, was still there and never really went away. And he saw the opportunity, saw an ad placed in the newspaper to audition for what was then, some people will recall, the Channel 9 Tarex show. And the Tarex show was a children's show, incredibly popular, with people like a young Graham Kennedy, Ernie Carroll, Patty Newton, or Patty McGrath as she was then, characters like Joffa Boy. It really was the place to be. He auditioned and landed a role, which was really something to behold because he was a little bit older by then too. So he performed on the Tarex show under the character name of Sloppo the Clown for several years and enjoyed that enormously before retiring. And then he performed privately for parties and families, occasions and things like that. But for him to have the opportunity once more in life to be able to don the makeup, go out and entertain people and make people laugh again after all that time, I can only imagine would have been just so incredibly satisfying and such a wonderful thing for him to be able to do and know that for one more time he could put the smiles on people's faces, children's faces. And behind this, of course, none of his castmates, none of the people he performed with had any idea of what they'd left behind and the life that they had endured to get there.
Okay, so I've got the next question. If you had your time again, are there any questions you'd like to ask Minla?
Oh, so many. I have said this so many times, particularly through the writing process. If I just had one more conversation with her, I have a million questions now. I probably have more questions now than I had when I first started, because when I first started, I kind of didn't really know that much of the story. I was trying to uncover bits of the story. Now, in hindsight, knowing what I know, there are so many things that I would love to have the opportunity to ask her. And I guess it comes down to, it's a life lesson for all of us that if you've got the opportunity to sit with people that are important to you and learn these sorts of history, you really should do it before it's too late. Minla, of course, there were some twists and turns in the research and we uncovered some things that she was not aware of. Some family members specifically that she didn't know had survived. So I've wrestled with that a lot lately. Would we tell her? How would we tell her? What would she think? How would she react if she knew? There are so many things that I would love to have the opportunity to have asked her, but sadly I'm not going to get that chance now.
Well, given, back to me again, given that you did uncover some really quite tragic family secrets along the way, how do you think she would have reacted and how did the family who were around to hear those revelations react?
That was quite a pivotal moment for us. So I should explain to people that have not read the book yet that along the way, Nana Manya believed that she and one other sister were the only survivors of their family. She was from a very big family of 12. She believed that her whole family had perished in Treblinka, which was where the majority of Warsaw Jews were taken to the gas chambers in Treblinka. But in the research, we uncovered that two brothers had actually survived too. They'd both been taken off to separate camps and lived their lives in various concentration camps, labour camps that run by the Nazis. One of those brothers eventually got passage after the war to America, where he set up a life in Baltimore and had a family and married. The other went to Israel and set up his life there. None of them ever knowing that the others existed. They all believed that their family, that they were the only survivors of their family. So it was quite confronting to learn that there was others that had survived. Initially, we found the first brother, Yaakov, in Israel, and that was a very overwhelming thing because he had searched for his family. Immediately after the war, he'd gone back to Warsaw. He'd tried to find them. He'd listed his name with the Red Cross in the hope that someone would come forward and tell him where they were, but no one ever did. So he lived his life with a great sadness, not finding his other siblings, and his family were quite overwhelmed too. And it's very strange, of course, for someone on the other side of Australia to ring someone you've never met in Israel and say, hello, I think you could be a relative. I can tell that's a really, really strange and bizarre thing to do. Likewise, again, when we found Yaakov quite early on, and that was quite pivotal for me in the research because he had also kept documents. He'd kept quite a swathe of documents detailing who his family were, the names of his brothers and sisters, who they were married to, their children's names, dates of birth, all sorts of wonderful material which filled in a couple of gaps for us, but also reiterated exactly what Nana had told too. It was different, slightly different again for the family of Mordka. They just could not believe that anyone had possibly existed. But the real tragedy of all of this was that the two brothers, Mordka, who'd lived in America for most of his life after the war, moved to Israel when he retired. And the two brothers lived around about a 25-minute drive away from one another and never knew that the other existed. They were never reconnected. So for the families now, that's quite difficult to process. It's been lovely meeting them and getting to know them, albeit online at the moment, of course, because we can't travel anywhere to see them. But that's been quite a revelation. And I've thought a lot about how Nana would react, what she would think of that. And I do think that probably might just be the thing that really tips in the trauma, I guess. I think to be able to know and acknowledge all of those occasions that you've missed, the conversations, the birthdays, I think that might have been possibly the tipping point that it was just, I think that would have been just a little bit too traumatic for her to deal with, to be honest. I'm not sure how she would have processed all of that.
That's great. And how has it changed the family?
I think it's definitely brought the family closer together. It's been a lovely family project, and particularly because I've relied in the research, I relied a lot on each of the individual memories of the family members. So Nan and Pop, as we knew them, had a very, very strong relationship with their grandsons, my husband and his cousins. They spent a lot of time with their grandchildren, and the grandchildren were just the apple of their eye. And each of the grandchildren, they're adults now, but each of the grandchildren had really unique and very, very strong memories of things that Pop had told them and Nana had told them. Each of them remembered Pop telling them fairy tales, when he was tucking them into bed at night, about the funny clown and how the funny clown escaped, tricked the Nazis and all these sorts of things that as children, they kind of brushed off as, slightly odd fairy tales. But now we know that those things were true. So it's been a unique experience for them too, to be able to connect the dots of what they were told and what they learned as children and the particular manner that he did this. But it's also, I think, very gratifying for them to be able to, for everyone to really understand the story, because none of us knew, none of us understood and really knew what happened and how on earth they came here. So I think it's added a lovely layer of fabric into the family to bring everyone together in a really special way.
That's lovely. That's really great to hear. Thank you, Sue. We've got a couple of questions from our audience members who were keen beans and resubmitted them.
Fabulous.
So the first question I've got for you is from Anne, who would like to hear more about how long the research took you.
And look at the bags under my eyes. It took a very long time. It was 5 years all up. So part of that was the last 2 were really full-time, and it was very tricky because I was researching in Australia, mostly researching in Poland, and the challenges of the language were Poland it's a really difficult language to sort of get your head around, and I couldn't. But the one thing that helped me, people were incredibly helpful. Nobody said no to me. So whenever I asked someone if they knew of a piece of information or knew where I could go to find something, and I would be sending random emails to people in Poland that I'd never met before, librarians and historians and all sorts of people. Everybody helped. Everybody came back to me. And one of the parts of it that I actually really enjoyed was I literally wake up in the morning and log in on my emails and see what had happened overnight. What did I learn overnight, and see what emails had come in. But it was a very slow process because of the language, and having things, I needed to have a lot of things translated. So it was much slower than I would have normally thought. Consequently, I missed 3 deadlines that the book was due on. My publishers were very, very patient and very, very kind. They were terrific. But one of probably the most pivotal research moments for me was actually when we went to Poland. I'd been put in touch with a man who runs the Polish National Circus Archive. Now, who would have even known that there was such a thing, right? But there is a circus archive there, and it's this place like Luna Park, but way out in the middle of nowhere. So you literally sort of drive through a forest in the middle of nowhere, and out of the blue pops up this kind of crazy Luna Park place. And at the back of that is an office, and this one man runs this whole archive, and he had boxes and boxes stacked up against the wall, and he'd said, come and look, come and search if you want to. So my husband and I went off on this afternoon. We had an English interpreter with us helping us. We went out to this place, and we literally sat down on the floor, and he said, maybe this box, maybe this box, maybe this box, pulled out these sort of dusty old boxes and started going through them. And literally in the middle of one of these boxes, I come across an album, which was photos of the Circus Staniewski, and in it were photos of Pop, a very young performing Pop. And I mean, my heart just broke. It was literally like looking at my 15-year-old son, and I actually said to my husband, oh my goodness, there's Charlie, look. And it was Pop. So we found this sort of needle in the haystack on search, and found all these wonderful things. And we found original circus programs. I used a lot of newspapers in the research. Prior to the war, newspapers were in abundance. So once war came, a lot of these documents were obliterated. There was just nothing available. But prior to the circus, I was able to get reviews that had been written in the newspapers about the circus. So I knew what the circus acts were, and I could really then sort of paint the picture of what was happening in the circus and who was performing and how they were performing. And I enjoyed that enormously. And it was, it was like gold to me every time I found one of these documents, and I'd send it off to Christina, who'd translate it for me and come back with new information. So I loved that process, but it does take a long time. And I think family research can be complex and long, and you need a lot of patience, but it's well worth it in the end.
And I've got, my one's actually probably not a question, but more of a statement. It's from David Horowitz, who just would like to say thanks for writing it.
Hi, David. David's in Israel. Hello. Hello, David. Hi, Sharon. That's really lovely of them. So David is one of my husband's cousins, and who was instrumental in being able to help me put this story together. David's dad is Gad in the book, or Dennis as he is known. So for those of you that have read the book and have seen the beautiful photos of that gorgeous little boy in the book, that's David's father. So hi, David. Thanks for tuning in. I couldn't have done it without all of their beautiful stories and their memories and their recollections. You know, even the tiniest little snippet of information was able to send me down another research path. So I have a lot to thank them for, and probably a little bit to curse them for too.
Can I say something?
Hello.
Is that right? Can I? Look, I want to say three things. One is that, look, firstly, it's jarring to hear your grandparents speaking. You can hear in their head, you can hear Polish, but they're coming out in Australia and, in a nice English. So that was one thing that was a bit jarring. There is a lot of pain. There is a lot of pain around the new relatives. What do you do with new people that and everyone's going, well, what do we do now? And why didn't they look for each other and all that, right? But the most important thing is that Sue's written a story, which is my story. I can't believe I've got a story. We had little bits here and there, and now we have a story. And that it's my story and our story. And I just can't, it's invaluable. I just can't believe it. Thank you very much. Okay, those are the things I want to say.
Stop it, David. You'll make me cry.
David, you're making me tear up. Goodness.
It is really difficult. David's right. It is. And like my husband actually hasn't read the book yet, because his memories of his grandparents are his memories of them. So, he remembers, he doesn't know these people, because these are different people. They were young. This was long before he came into the world. So for him, it's kind of like reading about some other people. So he wants his memories of his grandparents really to be those precious memories that he has of sleepovers and of Nana's chicken soup and all those sort of beautiful grandma, grandpa memories that you have. Even though people say he hasn't read the book, are you serious? I'm like, he has not read the book. But it is, an unusual experience, and it certainly is an unusual and really difficult experience finding family members you did not know existed. And there is still possibly, you go down a rabbit hole when you start doing family research, and you never really quite know where to stop and where to keep going. But I do believe that there is potentially one other sister who also survived and went to America, and all of her details fit the family detail, fit the profile of who she was and what she was. And I sort of traced her so far and then lost the trace. And in the midst of trying to write this, I knew I had to get this book out, and I had to kind of put her aside for a little bit, and I'll go back to that and see if I can find her. But I'm also a little bit apprehensive to find another living family member if she did survive. I think that would be just another layer of the heartbreak, I think, of it all.
Yeah, that's completely understandable. Last question from the Keen Beans I've got for you is from Deborah, and that was, how did you talk to your children about the Holocaust?
That's a very good question. Well, we've made a really conscious effort, and this was part of, the whole reason this began was because I wanted my children to understand I'm not Jewish, but I've married into a Jewish family. And it was really important to me that my children understood their heritage on both sides of the family. I haven't even started on the other side of the family yet, heaven help, but I needed them to know this, and I thought it was really, really important for them to do so. So we talk about it, we have conversations about it a lot, but I'm acutely conscious of making sure that their understanding of the Holocaust is far greater than mine ever was. And I honestly thought when I started this research and started this book that I had a pretty good understanding of the Holocaust. I thought I was pretty across it, but the more I delved into it and the more I researched, the more I realised just how little we really knew, how little any of us really, really know, and how much more there is still to be told and to be taught. And I don't believe that we're teaching enough of history in school at the moment. not just Holocaust, not just European history, but Australian history too, all of it. It's so vitally important for our children's futures, for them to know their past and know where they came from and know what happened in the world. That forms their future. So I think I've certainly made a far greater and far more conscious effort with my own children to really teach them and have conversations with them about it. And the children have read the book, which is great and really lovely of them. So that sort of deepens, I guess, their interest and their understanding of it too. But it's still not enough. We still need to do more.
Thanks, Sue. That's been great. And yeah, it's just been fantastic listening to all about the book. It's really enlightened me, and I'm sure it's enlightened everyone. Before we leave, though, I'd like to, I suppose before we do, is there any other questions from the audience?
We've got a couple that have just come through the chat, Kylie.
Okay, yeah.
So first off, Anne was asking if you know if you have a release date for the UK yet.
No, not yet, Anne, I don't know. And if you give your details to the girls, email them through, they'll flick them to me and I can let you know, but not as yet, I don't know. But the book is available, I believe it's available on Amazon, but I'm not good at those things. But I can certainly keep in touch with you and let you know.
Fantastic, thanks, Sue. And then David added an extra question of, did the book change your view of Australia or of human nature?
Of course, it changed my view of human nature. Did it actually? That's probably not true. Did it change my view of human nature? No. It probably cemented what I thought about the worst of human nature and probably the best. I think Australia has always been known as a country that's been, well, perhaps not so much recently, but back in that era, it certainly was, I would like to think, a country that welcomed and gave people opportunity. And it certainly, I would hope, is the land that they hoped it would be. Sunshine and ice creams and all those sorts of things. But I would imagine it was a very difficult place. Well, we know it was a very difficult place. For them too, they didn't speak the language. That was tricky. I don't think it's changed my view of the world and of humanity, but it certainly has reiterated to me how fragile the world can be at times and how important kindness and humanity are. And I think sometimes we don't have enough of that in the world, wherever we are, and just how important it is for all of us to be a bit kinder and to be a bit more considerate of others and others' needs and where they've come from. So I hope that it's made, I hope that it's eye-opening for other people too. The book was never designed to be a history lesson, but as I was going along writing and researching, I was discovering things for the first time that I didn't know either. And I thought, well, I need to put that context. It's really important that that context is in place, particularly for people who perhaps haven't had any experience of anyone who's survived the Holocaust. I felt that it was really important to be able to put that context in, that historical context in place to understand what was going on at the time. So that's sort of where it's at. But we can all be kinder, I think.
Thank you, Sue. And another question that's come through from Adam, who wants to know, does the book go into his time in Africa?
Goodness, we were all over tonight. We've got Africa, Israel, a bit of Morwell, a bit of East Gippsland. We are the United Nations of Latrobe Libraries tonight. How wonderful. Again, Adam, if you want to send an email through to the girls, or the girls can put up I don't mind you put up my MS. It's not look, again, it would be available on Amazon. At the moment, there are no specific plans for the book to go into Africa. Maybe that will happen at some later point, but I'm sure there's a way that we can get a book to you somehow.
That's not a question.
Oh, I was just going to, say that. Thank you. Sorry, Sue. Adam was wanting to know if the book discusses.
Oh, Africa? Yes, absolutely. Yes. Very important part of the journey. Yes, indeed. It's a huge part of their journey. Their time in Africa, in a refugee camp in Africa, is absolutely pivotal to the story. So yes, it certainly does. Sorry, I misunderstood your question completely, but absolutely it does.
Oh, David again. Oh, he's got a curveball for you on this one. Why of all the Holocaust stories should this one be highlighted? And he said in brackets, maybe a question Nana might ask.
Oh, because Nana was beautiful and more important than anyone, David. You should know that. No, I think certainly one of the things that I've come across in the research of this is just how many stories there are out there. I mean, this story is triumphant at the end. It is ultimately a happy story, and it's a great story of, particularly at the moment, it's very timely because it's a story of resilience and survival and coping. And it, you know, it's not lost on me at all that I was literally finishing up editing this book, you know, writing about how Nana had survived in a Russian jail, picking maggots out of porridge, you know, of all ghastly things, while outside in my own street, people were fighting over toilet paper in the supermarket. I mean, it just messed with my head completely where we'd gone. I think Nana's story is very special and it's unique, and there are many, many layers of the story that are important, but equally I think that there are so many other Holocaust stories. Every story needs to be told, every voice needs to be heard, and everyone who not only lost their lives but survived must also be recorded and acknowledged in some way. And that's why these stories are important, because these people mustn't be forgotten, and what they went through mustn't be forgotten either. We must never, ever forget what happened to this generation.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was a beautiful answer. We've got another question for you now from Vicky, who asks, how did you feel stepping into Manya's shoes to walk her journey, especially given she had passed away before the book was published?
It was a great privilege to be able to do that, and probably more profound for my husband than it was for me, because I'd been the one that had done all of this research. So I sort of knew what to expect and where we were going and what was going to be happening. But there was one particular moment. We were standing outside the jail in Bialystok, and it's a long way from, you know, kind of anywhere, literally standing on the corner of this jail, and the jail does not look much different from when Nana would have been in prison there all those years ago. And I could see my husband was quite overcome, and he just said, how on earth did she get from here to Melbourne? And I think that was probably the moment where the weight of it really, and the enormity of this journey that they took really sort of hit him. But at each point, you know, we caught the train from Warsaw to Bialystok. She was at some points walking that journey with a baby on her hip, or sometimes sitting on the back of a pretty rickety old car, trying to avoid the Nazis. I mean, you actually just can't comprehend what that would have been like. You really can't. But it does it added a layer of scope for me, and the sense of space, and you know, it's a great privilege to be able to do that. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take that as a lovely comment.
Okay, hi. Before we leave, I'd just like to thank Penguin Random House, Public Libraries Victoria, and of course Sue herself for making this event possible. It's been fantastic. You can borrow the book and any of her other books from both library services, either in physical or digital versions, or you can buy them from all good bookstores. If you're not a member of the library, either at Latrobe City or East Gippsland, please sign up, support our services, and help us more in terms of resources and programming. There are a couple of other author talks coming up at both Latrobe City and East Gippsland libraries, both at the libraries website or through, so you can book at the library's website or through Eventbrite. We've got all the days after with Sue Gunningham at East Gippsland. That's on Tuesday, the 24th of November from 6 p.m. This is the story of a loss and resilience following the Black Saturday bushfires. And then Latrobe City has Mothering with Jen Hutchinson on Thursday, the 3rd of December from 6:30 p.m. This is a story of finding and healing yourself after that unspeakable loss, healing through walking and talking what life throws at you one step at a time. And finally, you'll receive a feedback survey via email along with the recording later this week. Please let us know what you think. We really do value your feedback. And thank you again for coming. And once again, thank you to Sue. It's been fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for joining us from all corners of the world. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
So that was wonderful. And if you pop over into the chat function now, you're getting a few thank yous there as well.
Oh, I'll have a look. That's gorgeous. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Kylie. Thank you. Oh, that's beautiful. There you go. Look at that. Thank you, everyone. That's really beautiful. I'm very, very grateful for your time. You can all go and hop back into your PJs now and have a cup of tea or a glass of wine.